I am really happy and glad to have the opportunity to share some of the research that I've been doing for the past, oh golly, 4 years or so now, as part of a master's project, and now I'm a research associate, as Patrick mentioned. And my project was to look at the mental models of both farmers and researchers and extension personnel about organic weed management. Um, So I did most of my interviews with farmers. Let's see here. I need to scroll this forward. In Ohio and Indiana, I did 29 different on-farm, in-person interviews and asked farmers several questions about their weed management. And I also interviewed several weed ecologists, weed biologists, extension personnel, extension researchers, and created two different models. One we call the expert model, although I don't want that to sound like it's the right model. It's just that we call those people experts, and one was the farmer model. Because basically, as Alan said, we really wanted this research to be the baseline for beginning that really crucial conversation between scientists and extension outreach and organic farmers, since the history hasn't been so great. We'd like to start with what the farmers know and what the expert community knows, and see if there's agreement or disagreement anywhere in there. So I'll just explain briefly what a mental model is. It's a specific approach to looking at how somebody thinks about something. So everybody has a mental model that helps you interpret what you're seeing, for instance, the weed on the right there, to make decisions about that object and to solve problems. It's sort of your internal construction of what the external world is showing you. So here we have a farmer who may see some Canada thistle and think several things, perhaps an expletive. There's a lot of emotion involved in mental models, perhaps immediately thinking about the location of the weed, what sort of management tactic they might like to use with it, maybe what that weed might mean in terms of soil nutrients, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's very practical for farmers. So they're out there every day during the growing season dealing with weeds, and their mental models are very practical and useful. The expert model, on the other hand, is a bit different. This model is more theoretical in nature, often based on research, perhaps a little less infused with emotion, and possibly more complex than a layperson's mental model. So when a researcher or extension agent sees weeds, they may be thinking immediately about biology, phenology, what kind of root it has, these sorts of more objective kinds of things. So we constructed both models into a visual diagram. Let me scroll forward. In order to sort of start this communication pathway. So Alan talked about this as well. It's really good to start with the farmer's knowledge, beliefs, and perceptions about whatever object we're talking about, in this case, weeds. And so when you develop models, then you're able to sort of weed out what the audience or the farmer already knows in order to develop targeted information and targeted outreach material for them. And when you construct mental models and communication based on mental models, and you're using the actual knowledge, beliefs, and perceptions of farmers, then you give them what they need to know rather than what they should know. Sometimes best practices could be lumped into that in order for them to make more informed decisions about their weed management. Really briefly, this may look sort of complicated. This is one of the visual diagrams of the mental model. And what you're seeing on the top are operational attributes of the farm. This was developed through the interviews. So after we did all the interviews, we analyzed them to create this model based on the interviews, as well as some theories of decision science, or how people make decisions. And what we found was that there's, attributes of the farm, things like soil type, cropping system, regulations such as the NOP, that are present in both models, experts and farmers. There's also attributes of the farmer. These are internal attributes such as how they learn, what kind of knowledge they have about weeds, sort of farmer traits, personality traits, and farmer values. These are two of the first things that influence a person's perceptions about weeds. So knowledge and learning, experience is very important for farmers, as well as more external things like what sorts of tools do I have available, what kind of cash flow, what kind of labor do I have available. All of these things are influencing how they perceive the risk or the benefit of a certain weed. And that's what flows into perceptions of weed risks and weed benefits, as well as different kinds of management risks, weed management risks and weed management benefits. And these perceptions are influencing how farmers are making a decision about a weed. So it flows into decision of either, and this bottom part here is very much an expert-based part of the model, critical weed-free management, where you're managing the visible weed at certain key points in time. And over here we have seed bank management, which is very long-term, including longer rotations, cover cropping, mulching, very ecologically based sorts of management approaches. And of course, farmers fall somewhere in the middle of lots of cultivation or maybe little cultivation versus cover cropping and crop rotations. So they make a decision, they behave in a certain way, and then this loops back, this trial and error or experience loops back into how a farmer learns about weeds and weed management and starts the whole process over again, either adjusting or solidifying their mental model of how they manage weeds. Now the important thing about this is when we compared expert model to farmer model, there were very few differences. The only major or significant differences between the two were learning sources about weeds and weed management, some personality traits, and many of these sorts of operational attributes, which actually made up such a small part of the model that we didn't pay too much attention to that part. So I think the key lesson from these two models is that farmers know an incredible amount about weed management. The model congruity between the two is high, while researchers might speak of weed management in more biological terms, or maybe use things like ecological weed management as a term. Farmers talked about the same things in their own language through their own experiences. So as Alan was saying, farmers are experts, which makes sense because they're out there every day. Of course, there might be some variation based on whether they're a newer farmer or a longtime farmer, whether they've always been organic or have transitioned from conventional. But on the whole, in the Midwest, we found farmers to be very, very knowledgeable about different weed management options, the types of weeds on their farm, all of these sorts of things. So the question is, if the two mental models are in alignment with each other and farmers know a lot, then why is there still such a struggle with weeds? We tend to think that if there's the right knowledge out there, then the correct behavior will follow. So this is where some of the social science, which I've studied a little bit, comes into play. And the major point is that organic farmers are making a decision in a very complex context. So ecological weed management and ecological agroecosystems are very complex. And when humans make decisions in a complex environment, they tend to try to make shortcuts. They might discount the future in favor of short-term gains. And they use their values a lot when making a decision, which is something else that Alan also talked about. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of these, and all of these results came out of my interviews with farmers. So when we talk about how farmers are making a decision, we can see here that farmers talked about experience in their making significantly more often than the researchers and experts that we interviewed. On the other hand, which is probably expected, experts, researchers, outreach extension personnel talked much more about science and research as part of a decision process than the farmers did. So when farmers are saying, well, I'm using a lot of experience in my decision making, this can lead to use of shortcuts or heuristics. So the experts we talk to are very experiment-based and comfortable with the complexity, but farmers are very experience-based and often looking for a cause and effect between their management practices and the weed populations on their farm. And two things that came out of this sort of finding is that a lot of times farmers are looking for weeds to indicate soil nutrient deficiency. So this is one example where they're trying to use weeds as a shortcut. Oh, I've got a lot of Canada thistle, so I'm probably short on calcium because they're trying to bring up the calcium from deeper in the soil. That would be one example. And the other example is that when you're looking for a cause and effect, oftentimes it's a sort of shorter term trial and error rather than keeping records and looking over the long term of weed management decisions. So farmers could be reaching into their shorter term memory to make decisions rather than a long term experiment would do. Another thing that we found was that farmers sort of viewed the agricultural risks of cover crops differently than the experts. So the way that researchers are thinking about cover crops and farmers are thinking about cover crops is slightly different. So scientists are more focused on the ecological effects of cover cropping, while farmers are more concerned with cover crops as part of the whole farm system. So the risks of a cover crop to tying up nutrients, perhaps interfering with a harvest later on if it sort of gets too tall and grassy. And they're also worried about the risks of a bad crop stand when it comes to cover cropping. So that the cover crop topic as a whole is really important for organic farmers. Alan brought that up as well. But the mechanics behind it might be viewed differently between the two and the risks and benefits. Let me talk about that a little more. So a lot of times farmers might discount the future benefits of cover crops because it takes a while for the cover crops to work in order to deplete the seed bank as a whole. There needs to be several years of diverse cropping for the seed bank, that invisible layer of seeds in the soil, actually depletes. So farmers might favor more short-term approaches to weed management, such as hand cultivation or just simply cultivation, because it's much easier to see the benefits of a nice clean row rather than to invest in cover crops, which can be fairly expensive. That was another risk farmers mentioned, was the economic price of cover crops for many years before you see a result. I mean, you're also taking some fields out of production to go into cover crops. So that's another reason why farmers might favor short-term gains over long-term gains. And then the last point was that farmers have pretty strong values, and they use these values to weigh the different management options that they have. So are they more interested in the short-term economics of a certain crop rotation versus long-term soil health? Would they rather see clean fields free of weeds, or can they sort of tolerate a certain level of weeds or weed threshold? Are they more interested in ecological partnerships, or are they looking to maximize their economic viability? Oftentimes farmers talked about those two in the same breath and said they aren't distinct. But values play a really big role in how farmers are viewing different weed management options. So what can we do with this information when we are talking to organic farmers about weed management? And one of the things we're trying to develop is called a decision tool. This is just a screenshot of what it might look like in the future. This would be sort of an interactive tool where extension outreach and farmers could sit down together and go through this tool, and you would ask the farmer, what's important to you? Are you looking at your net revenue? Are you looking at environmental stewardship? Are you looking at freeing up some of your time? And they can sort of go through and choose weights for how important those things are to them. And this decision tool will then show them how different management strategies would perform on those values. And sometimes this gets a little complicated, but basically what it's saying is if you value stewardship and you are looking at increasing your cultivation, then that might not be the best way to farm based on the values that you just told me about. So it's kind of a way to give farmers different options, to provide them with some different ways of thinking about how they can manage weeds that would best line up with their values. So it's not prescribing any weed management. It's a tool that's helping to inform them and be more deliberative about the decision they're making, so they maybe don't use these heuristics or discounting biases when making a decision. And that's going to come out pretty soon, hopefully. And I think it'd be a really interesting tool to use for both extension agents and farmers to help see, like, okay, if I use more seed bank management strategies, how is that performing on my economic viability values, or how is that performing on my lifestyle free time values? And it'll kind of show you in real time the different ways that different weed management strategies perform on value-based weights. And then I think the last thing here that I have are some specific communication recommendations based on some of the farmer risk perceptions and beliefs. So farmers often have this, often talked about the risks of weed management over an entire season. That's more than simply yield loss, but it can affect harvest, time, labor. They have a very holistic view of weed management over the entire season. And so we recommend incorporating things like the cost and time of labor and crop quality to better represent economic impacts of weed management strategies for farmers, so we can give them those numbers and help them make a decision. Farmers were also very aware of weed management decisions' effects on soil quality and soil health. This is very big for them. So identifying the benefits and risks of different weed management practices on soil quality, conducting research on cultivation effects, cover crop usage, and tillage on soil health, and giving them that kind of information may help them to decide, maybe I could try no-till, or perhaps I might do inversion tillage only once rather than every 3 years or so. You know, just providing them with some information to help them make a better decision for their farm is really important. Got a couple more here. Farmers learn best from their own experience, as well as the experiences of other farmers, which is why field days are so important. Research could definitely do some more on-farm trials with farmers and engage farmer advisory boards and different networks of farmers throughout the research process. That would gain a lot of credibility with organic farmers. Alan talked about that as well. We know that farmers are using shortcuts to speed up their complex decisions and save time, which farmers don't have a whole lot of. So research that provides data that supports or debunks some of the heuristics, such as indicator weeds, would be very valuable for farmers to help them to see if the shortcuts they're using are actually in their benefit. We know that farmers may discount the long-term benefits of many practices. So this decision tool that I showed you an example of would be a helpful way to see long-term costs and benefits of different management decisions, rather than giving up on long-term practices for immediate payoffs. And then the last slide here, I believe. A few of the farmer beliefs that we could use to help with communication were the sort of indefinite life of weed seeds in the soil. And Eric, I think, is going to talk quite a bit about, or some more about this, but illustrating different effects of weed management practices on the seed bank and half-lives of seeds would be really important for farmers. We talked about the indicator of soil nutrients belief already, and then this last belief here is the experts very concerned with interconnected effects of weed management and ecology. So long-term trials of ecological weed management practices under different conditions for Throwdale Institute trials would be really interesting for farmers to know about and see. That would help them to sort of cut back on some of the shortcuts that might not be so beneficial for them in the long term.